Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate science guy setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I ask the question, is Arctic sea ice actually disappearing as NOAA shows in this graph? The graph shows that Arctic September sea ice extent has declined about 30% since 1979, and Arctic March sea ice extent has also declined since 1979. So the question is, why did they start the graph in 1979? What they say on their website is that's the beginning of the satellite era, but I'm not so sure about that. This graph is from the 1990 IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it shows NOAA satellite data going back to 1974. Note that NOAA starts their current graphs right at this peak in 1979 and leaves off all the data prior to that, which was much lower. Why do they do that? Well, the reason why they do this is simple. By starting their graphs in 1979, right at the peak, they can show a linear downward trend, which gets blamed on carbon dioxide. But if they started their graph when their data actually begins in 1974, then it would look like a cycle which goes up for a while and then comes down for a while, and that doesn't correlate very well with carbon dioxide. This story already looks bad for NOAA, but it gets much worse. There was another report written in 1985 by the Department of Energy titled Projecting the Climatic Effects of Increasing Carbon Dioxide. This was done by a study group who was the predecessor to the IPCC, and they showed Arctic sea ice data going all the way back to 1925 when it was high, then it declined to about 1955, rose again to 1965, and declined again to about 1974 when the IPCC data began from the 1990 report. It shows cyclical behavior rather than linear, and no correlation with carbon dioxide. So what happens if we merge the 1985 DOE graph and the 1990 IPCC graph? Well, let's try it and find out. I'm bringing the two graphs together at the same scale on both axes. This merged graph looks even more cyclical and less linear. There doesn't appear to be any correlation with carbon dioxide at all. Arctic sea ice increased from the mid-1950s until 1990. But something else really stands out in this graph. Look at 1979, where NOAA currently starts their sea ice graphs. It's right at the peak for the last century. By starting their graphs in 1979, they can show a sharp descent in sea ice since then. So the way that NOAA tries to excuse their very bad behavior is by claiming that all the data before 1979 is unreliable, and this big dip shown in the 1985 DOE report didn't actually exist. So let's ask the question, did it exist? Why, yes, it did. Here's an article from the New York Times from 1958. Some scientists estimate that the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half century ago, and that even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic Ocean may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole. They were predicting an ice-free Arctic within one generation in 1958. This next paragraph is also very interesting. Although the idea that a solid ice sheet covers the central Arctic has lingered stubbornly in the popular fancy, the northern cap of ice worn by our planet is actually a thin crust, on the whole only about 7 feet thick over an ocean 2 miles deep in places. That's about the same thickness the Arctic sea ice is now. The other interesting thing about this paragraph is that it dispels the still widely held superstition that Arctic sea ice used to be very thick. It wasn't very thick in 1958. So is there other evidence besides this 1958 article? Well, here's another article from 1940. It says the North Pole, it's getting warmer. Polar temperatures are on an average 6 degrees higher than those registered by Nansen 40 years ago. That's a lot of warming in 40 years. Ice measurements were on an average only 6.5 feet against 9.5 to 13 feet at the beginning of the 20th century. So there was a sharp decline in thickness of Arctic sea ice from 1900 to 1940 to levels where it currently is now. And this closely matches what we saw in the 1985 DOE graph. Arctic sea ice declined sharply. So we have to ask the question once again, why is NOAA hiding the pre-1979 data? There's a lot of very important information there which is being lost by throwing that data out. And what they're showing now with the linear trend down from 1979 is not representative of the actual science of the Arctic. By hiding the pre-1979 data, NOAA is intentionally misleading the public. They want you to believe that there's a linear downward trend in Arctic sea ice and that it's caused by carbon dioxide and will eventually lead to an ice-free Arctic. But if we look at all of the data, we see that Arctic sea ice is cyclical and has no relationship to carbon dioxide, and there's no reason to believe that eventually the Arctic is going to become ice-free. What NOAA's doing by hiding the pre-1979 data is intentionally misleading the public. It's junk science at its worst. Please visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.